This is Serendib Kitchen, and I'm Mohanraj, and today we're going to make beef and potato curry. This is, I think, one of the first things I learned how to cook. I called my mom from college after I'd been eating dorm food for, I don't know, a month or so, was about how long I lasted, and said, please, please, please teach me how to make one of your curries. And my favorite growing up was her beef and potato curry. So that's what I made. She told me over the phone how to do it with somewhat imprecise instructions, but good enough. And then I made it over and over and over again for most of that year, beef and potato curry with rice, or sometimes I just eat it with bread. And it is still my comfort food and one of the most reliable things. I've made it so often, I think I could basically make it in my sleep at this point. So, first step is just going to be chopping onions, and then we're going to use about 3 onions, usually about 3 potatoes. I happen to have a mix of russet and gold potatoes, but I generally recommend russet for this because it's sort of, it has the right texture, it'll break down nicely. The gold potatoes will stay a little firmer, that's fine too. We do usually peel the russet potatoes, and I don't usually peel the gold ones, so that's up to you. There's a lot of nutrients in the skin. If you're not going to peel them, just wash them. And I think that's basically it. So I'm going to chop the onions coarsely, get the potatoes ready, and then we're going to put in 2 to 3 pounds of chuck roast. And you want chuck because, or something, a similar cut, because you're going to cook this for, you know, not a really long time, but a little bit low and slow, and it'll break down nicely and be delicious. Chuck is also an inexpensive cut of meat, and so if you are a college student on a tight budget, it's a good option for you. Okay, so I'm going to cut and we'll be back. Okay, so onions are all chopped. I'm going to transfer these into the pot, and then next step, we'll be getting the potatoes ready. All right, on to the potatoes. Again, this one's a russet. If it's got some little eyes that it started to grow, you just break those off. Just means it's getting ready to make new potatoes, but we don't actually want to plant them and make new potatoes. So, as you're peeling, just be sure if there's any bits that are a little green, that you get those, because those are not so good for you. Sometimes there's a little bit of green under the skin. Doesn't mean you have to get rid of the potato, it just means you want to peel that off. This one doesn't seem to have it, so we're good. And don't feel like you have to get every little bit of potato skin off, because it's good for you if there's a little bit of skin in there. It's not going to hurt anything in the curry. I would take out any of these, I think they're maybe called eyes, so that's what this bit is for, to help you scoop that out. Get that nice and clean. And if you have to go in there with your knife, go in there with your knife. All right, so back to cutting them, and I would cut these into fairly big chunks. If you cut them too small at this point, they'll just dissolve while you're cooking. So this big-ish pieces. They don't need to be particularly regular. This is Sri Lankan cooking, not French cooking. We do not pull out a ruler to measure the size of our potato pieces. All right, last step, cutting up the beef. I've rinsed it, and I'm gonna clear the potatoes away. So now I'm not an expert in preparing beef meat in general. One thing you do want to generally do is get rid of any bits of excess fat, bits of skin, so on. It's a little bit up to you how persnickety you want to be about that. My mother would be very persnickety, and she said it made it taste better too. I admit I am not quite as careful as she is, but I will try and take off sort of all of this, I think it's called silver skin, as well as that extra bit of fat. So this will take a little bit. I'll clean it, and then I'll cut it into chunks. It's fine, so I've gotten that off, the silver skin. It's fine if there's still some fat here, because that's just going to cook down as we cook, and you actually want that. It's going to bring a lot of flavor to the dish. If your meat is very fatty, you might want to cut most of it off, but definitely don't feel like you've got to get every little bit. If you have too much fat, what'll happen is you'll end up, as you cook it, with a sort of a film of fat over the top, and you can skim that off at the end. All right. Meat is clean. Now we're going to cut it up, and my mom would cut it pretty small, so I will as well. Some people cut their beef curry into bigger chunks. That's kind of up to you. And again, they're not going to be perfectly even, and that's fine. Okay, so at this point, we have a bunch of small pieces. I'm going to say 1/2 inch to 1 inch. They're pretty variable, honestly, but that's fine. So, all right. Now at this point, you have a couple different approaches you could take. I'm going to just talk them out. One thing you can do is heat the oil in the pan, add mustard seed, and cook that for a little while. That's a pretty traditional start. And what that does is it turns the oil into mustard oil, and it's going to impart a lot of flavor. I mostly, especially when I was first learning to cook, my mom didn't actually tell me to do that. She just had me heat the oil in the pan, add the chopped onions, and add cumin seed and mustard seed. So that's what we're going to do. And in fact, I've already put the onions in the pan, so I'm going to add the oil to that and cumin seed and mustard seed. Then another thing you could do at that point is you could add ginger and garlic. That would be delicious, but I'm doing a stripped down, sort of super basic version of this curry, which is still very yummy. There are lots of ways you could fancy it up. The last thing is you could brown the meat. So you could heat the oil, put it in the pan, put the meat in the pan, not crowding it too much, so maybe in 2 batches, because if you put all of it in at once, it's going to give off a lot of moisture, and the meat will end up steaming instead of browning. So small batches, put it in, stir it, or don't stir too much, basically let it brown, turning it over so all the sides brown, and then take that out again, remove it to a bowl. And if you do that step of searing the meat, it will add another layer of flavor. That's not a traditional cooking technique in Sri Lanka, I think. That's something that I started doing, making European beef stews, but it certainly works exactly the same way here. Again, I generally don't bother with that unless I am feeling very indulgent and that I want to my husband likes this beef stew, and if I want to make him like the best possible version of it, then I probably would sear the beef in advance. Last thing is you can add wine. So that is very much not a Sri Lankan thing, but I wanted to mention it because if you were making, say, a beef stew of the European variety, often you would add red wine. And what that does, I'm not sure of the science of it, but it interacts with the tomatoey stuff that we're going to put in and unlocks sort of another set of deep, complex flavors. So I do actually often add a little bit of wine to my beef curry, depending on whether I have a bottle of red open or not. So feel free to do that, and remember, one for the pot and one for the cook. So that's up to you. But you could drink some red wine while you're making this. Okay, next step, we're gonna move over to the stove. We're gonna cook the onions in the oil, add cumin and mustard seed, add the meat and some other spices, and ketchup. We'll talk about the ketchup. Okay, so we're back. I am heating onions in vegetable oil. You could use ghee if you had ghee on hand. I'm going to add cumin seed and mustard seed. Now, when I was learning how to make this, I managed to get some sort of measurements out of my mom, but she was kind of vague about it on the phone. So I went home and I tried asking my mom for some more exact measurements, and she started making the dish, and she would just basically do this, right? And I would be like, that's not an exact measurement. And she was like, look at it. It looks right. See? It looks right. So what I ended up doing for when I first started working on a cookbook, my first cookbook, Taste of Serendib, is I literally stood under the stove, under her hands. I put my hands over the pot, is what I'm trying to say. And she would throw the seeds in and I would catch them, and then I would take them over to the counter and measure them, and then bring them back and put them in here. And she thought that was all ridiculous, but it did mean that I was able to finally write down some measurements for you guys. So, okay, so we have cumin seed and mustard seed, black mustard seed or brown mustard seed. Try not to use yellow, it has a very different flavor. And then we're also going to add cardamom, cloves, and cinnamon. So, Cubby, can you grab those? My daughter is recording for me. Cinnamon, you know, right? Cinnamon stick? Yep, that's right. And then right below that are the cloves. So I'm just going to put in a whole stick of cinnamon. That's easy. All right. And then I'm going to put in 3 cloves. 1, 2, 3. And next to the cinnamon now, that other small jar is the cardamom. Yep, those are cardamom pods. All right, I put in 3 cardamom pods. So those are pretty strong. Biting into them is kind of unpleasant, but they give a great flavor. So if you feel like, oh, I don't want to risk biting into whole spices, which it's easier to avoid them when you eat with your hands because you'll notice that you have a cardamom pod in your hand. But if you're eating with a fork, maybe you might bite into one. You can always either use ground cardamom or put your whole spices in a little cheesecloth bag that you take out at the end. That's up to you. All right, so now we're going to cook this for a while on medium to medium high, stirring until the onions are golden translucent. It's going to take a little while, so we'll come back. Right now, they look like this, and they need to change color maybe 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, maybe a little longer. All right, we'll be back. And now we see the child being taught how to make beef curry. Tapia is now 13, and this is basically all that my mother let me do when I was her age, is chop onions and stir onions. So far she's mostly escaped chopping onions because she starts to cry and then seems sad. and I let her stop. But at some point, I'm going to have to teach her to work through the pain.
I don't remember that ever happening.
You don't remember that ever happening? Oh, well, maybe that was when you were much younger, which means perhaps it's time for you to learn how to cut onions. Yeah.
Don't you cut them?
What?
You just cut them. And
You just cut them. It's just like anything, but you have to like, mostly it's learning how to be okay with the fact that it's making your eyes sting. So, which can take a little while. So, those are getting there. I would say they're translucent. They're not quite at golden translucent yet. Is your arm getting tired?
Just up here.
Yeah. Well, tough. Keep going. Keep going.
To be able to use both of my hands. I
Yes.
can try with this. I tried earlier.
Yeah, no. You don't really have to stir absolutely constantly, even if my mother did say that's how you end up with burned onions. I used to read a book while I was doing this, and that is how you end up with burned onions, because you're not really paying so much attention. Kavya has been watching a show and listening to it on her headphones, which she seems to think is not disturbing her concentration any. And I told her that in my day, we had to read books because there were no cell phones, and she doesn't know how we survived that. Anything else you want to add?
No.
No? That's it. All right. So, you could cook them a little longer if you really wanted to, but at this point they're fairly translucent and starting to turn golden. I think that's good enough. So, now we add just a few more things. Wait, daughter of mine, come back. I need you. I need you to hand me spices. Okay, so over there's, on the far end, there's a red jar. Yeah. There you go. It's heavy. I know. Okay, this is raw red chili powder. So I'm actually going to put the fan on because this can be a little smoky when it goes in. So you put in as much as suits your heat level. So I'm putting in only 1 spoon because this batch of chili powder is pretty hot. And we're going to use curry powder that has the cayenne already blended in as well. So it's pretty hot. So up there, the orangish jar, that's the one. So I'm stirring in the cayenne, often called chili powder in Sri Lanka, but I generally say cayenne because otherwise people in America get confused and think I mean what we use for chili, which is a completely different blend. So, okay, Sri Lankan curry powder with some cayenne mixed in, spices dark roasted, ground. You can do it at home, you can buy it online, you can buy it from me. All of these are good options. Okay, and 1 to 2 teaspoons, roughly, is good. And then we're almost done with adding things. We want a teaspoon of salt. Need to refill the salt shaker, but there's just enough of that. And then the last thing is ketchup, which you could do it old school and have tomatoes and vinegar and sugar, and salt, which is basically what ketchup is. But if you use ketchup, then it speeds up the process because the tomatoes would take longer to cook down. So. I would do 2 cooking spoons worth of ketchup very quickly. Okay. Now I made this to the spice level that your dad and I like, which is pretty spicy. You could do it completely mild. You don't have to put any hot stuff in there at all. And if I loved you, Kavya, maybe I would have done that, or just put in a little bit so that you could enjoy this too, especially since you labored over it. But no. All right. Now I'm going to add the meat. And stir that in nicely. And we're almost done with sort of like the active doing of stuff. That's all blended in. This is also, if you were going to add some wine, you could add a half cup of wine now. You want to bring this up to a boil. My stove's going to start cooking, so you're going to bring it up to high and then cover it, turn it down again, and let it cook for a while. Let it cook partway through, add the potatoes, and then let it cook for a while longer. And then at the end, we're just going to taste it, probably add a little lime juice and a little milk or coconut milk, and then you'll be done. So I don't know if that seems simple to you, but it's simple to me. So, and I learned how to make this when I was 18. So if I can do it with no cooking experience, aside from chopping and stirring onions, because that's all I was allowed to do, then you can too. So, all right, we're gonna let this go for a bit. So I said you can make it fancy. So 2 things you can add that will make it better. Curry leaves, if you can get them, which they're easier to find these days, and in fact you can even, in America, and you can even order them on Amazon, and I tried it just to check, and it actually worked pretty well. I'm putting the stems in too. I'll take them out at the end. And Worcestershire sauce, which is, it has a little bit of, I want to say anchovies in it. Let me just make sure that's right. Yes, anchovies among other things. And that adds umami. It adds a nice bit of extra flavor. All right. Cubby, come show people what this looks like now. All right. Okay, got it. All right. So now we're gonna cover it and let it cook for half an hour, and then we'll be back to add the potatoes. Okay, so we're back, and it's been about 30 minutes, and you should stir periodically in there. Now, I somewhat deliberately did what often happens if you're not paying too much attention, and my mom would always get mad at me about, which is that it starts to scorch a little bit, things start sticking to the bottom of the pan. Now, if you really let it go, then you get super burnt stuff and it's ruined and you're very sad, and that burnt flavor will permeate everything. But if it's just sort of sticking and building up this sort of caramelized layer here, but not gone all the way to scorched yet, that's actually not a bad thing. That's called the fond, F-O-N-D, and it's actually like part of French cooking is you kind of want to do that, and then you take your wine, and then you deglaze the pan. So you could also do this with water if you didn't want to add wine. But adding that liquid, as it gets warm, it will break down and dissolve the fond, and that's going to add a lot of really yummy flavor to your dish, kind of a deep, robust, caramelized-y kind of flavor. So I really like that. And all of that, it feels a little bit like kitchen magic, because all that black stuff that was there, maybe not black, but dark, dark brown stuff, has now disappeared. So, and you have this beautifully rich dark meat. So, all right, at this point, we're going to add the potatoes. If you put them in at the beginning, they will turn to mush over the hour of cooking, so you don't want to do that. Put them in halfway through, stir them in, and at this point, you could do it earlier or you could do it later. You want to have enough liquid in here to cook the potatoes, and mine is a little low on liquid for that. So you can add water to cover. I'm going to actually add some milk and some water. Just be a little careful when you're adding the milk that you stir it in, because what you don't want is to have the milk curdle. If milk gets, let me see if I think this is right. If milk gets sort of like too hot too quickly, it'll curdle and it'll start cooking essentially and trying to turn into whatever the next stage is, curds. which I think makes yogurt or butter eventually, neither of which we want here. What you want is a nice milky sauce. So just stir it so that the temperature distributes evenly. I'm not sure if what I'm saying makes any sense right now. What do you think, Kavya?
I get it.
You get it? It actually does make sense? All right, good. I'm gonna add some water too. Because I want more liquid. I basically want the potatoes, the tops of potatoes to be covered. And then you're just gonna bring it up to a boil, put the lid on, turn it down to medium, and then cook it for another half hour until the potatoes are all cooked. I'm a little distracted here because my daughter is doing a TikTok dance on the other side of this camera. So it's very charming, but she will not come and do it for you because she's not dolled up. So
I also don't actually know the dance. I've only seen it a couple times.
okay.
That would not go well.
It wouldn't go well. So she has to perfect her TikTok dance before you're allowed to see it. So, all right. So now we have a beautiful meat and potato curry looking thing, and we just have to cook the potatoes and let the meat flavor kind of like permeate everything. So we will be back. Okay. So we're back, and we've let the potatoes cook, and at this point, I did check it periodically, and I added a little more water at one point because I wanted to be sure that there was enough there for the potatoes to cook in, and that it wasn't all cooking off too much, in which case you could burn it. So we want to avoid that, and that is pretty close to done. The last thing is lime juice. So Amma always said to check the salt and lime at the end of the dish, and you have to get that sort of balance right. So it's pretty typical for Sri Lankan food that we would add some fresh lime. You can certainly use bottled lime juice at the end of a curry. So Sri Lankan food tends to be a balance of salt, tang, sweet, and spicy. The sweetness here is coming mostly from the tomatoes and the ketchup. If you're going to use tomatoes instead of ketchup, you might add a little brown sugar or jaggery for that sweetness. And that is probably pretty much done. Do you know how we test it, Kavya?
Eat it?
Well, you could eat it, but usually we want to like taste the sauce and make sure. We used to call this, so this looks like, you know, sort of like gravy, right?
Yeah.
We would call it kolombu, is the name for it. You get a nice, thick, rich, dark kolombu, and you just want to taste it. Did you see that? You weren't looking. Here, I'll do it again.
The dog was being distracting.
My dog was being distracting. Okay. You take a little sauce, like that.
I saw that.
You taste it and you just see, like, does it need a little bit of anything? Does it need, and I actually think it needs a little more salt. Oh, you can add more salt to the sauce like this. There's a little bit. So, and then you could add a little more milk. We used regular milk and not coconut milk because it's not for a party. Coconut milk is a little richer. If we're doing it for a party, we might have used coconut milk instead. Which is also a little bit sweeter, so that's where you get the, again, that sweetness. And here I've got a plate with some rice, some spinach curry, little coconut sambal, a little eggplant sambal. Usually we have some accompaniments along with the rice, and you could just take some of this and pile it on with as much, you know, you can go more in the meat direction or more in the potatoes direction. That's kind of up to you. Although I have to admit, so this would be sort of a traditional meal, but when I was in college, I often did not bother with any of this, and I would take just a loaf of white bread and put some beef curry and potato curry on a slice of white bread and eat that, and it was so tasty. So that's it, Sri Lankan beef and potato curry. And I will see you in our next cooking video. Thanks, Kavya. I kept her up late on a school night to do this. Bye.